Addiction never affects just the addict. It affects all of us. Recovering from addiction and alcoholism is also a life-changing battle for families dealing with a loved one's addiction. Numerous programs support addicts as they reclaim their lives, while their families face their own challenges without the same guidance. You're listening to Voices in Courage with KL Wells, where we transform the lives of the families and loved ones of addicts and alcoholics from surviving to thriving in the midst of chaos. Tune in as we highlight vulnerable stories of families who have addicted relatives and friends and learn how they have dealt with the challenges of isolation, desperation, and shame. If you are seeking ways to live your best life, then we welcome you into this safe space. Be a part of change today with your host, KL Wells.
So welcome, the audience. We have Voices in Courage today, and I am very excited to have one of my colleagues in the Vistage world on with me today. We share some commonalities in our own loving people who have been dealing with or have dealt with, whether they're dealing with or in recovery at this point, addiction. And because we both operate in the executive space, the corporate world, I think this is a really ripe conversation to be having that some people are willing to have and some are not willing to have. But the silence needs to stop. So welcome, Jan Salisbury. Very glad to have you with me today.
Good to be with you, KL, and thank you for all the work you and your organization are doing. It's absolutely critical.
Thank you. And so just a little bit of a backdrop on your story. You have 3 different people that you have in your family or in your life that have been touched by this disease. So if you would just, give us your story, that'd be great.
The first person was my niece, who had been sexually assaulted when she's a teenager. And as you know, that's a very common, a lot of people in recovery have been sexually assaulted. And she started on alcohol, and then she went to cocaine and crack, and she's been in recovery off and on over the years, but this last time really has stuck. She knows what to do. She knows to go back to AA. So she has her own business, and she has a grown child, and she's actually doing better than I've ever seen.
Great. So you've known her all of her life. Yes. Yeah. And so being an aunt and going through the experience of understanding what's going on, how did you navigate this?
I didn't ever judge her. I was there to support her, even in her crazy times.
Sure.
She wasn't coming across very sane. And I just really encouraged her as much as I could. She doesn't live on the West Coast. So that I couldn't have, she came out a few times, but I couldn't really have that kind of close contact with her. But she knows that I was there for her, and she's told me that many times.
And so how did that being there for her show up? Because there's such a variety of ways to be there for people. And I think it's one of the main struggles for a lot of people who love people in the throes of addiction is, how do I be present for somebody in a way that is going to serve them? What does that look like, sound like, and feel like? And how do I figure out my way through that?
I guess I have enough of a background. And of course, then the other people in my family started to show up. So she really respected AA. Regardless of whether or not she went back and forth, she understood that was the way for her to recover, is to be in AA. And she sponsored people. I mean, she did a bunch of stuff. So she always gave back. And she was always welcome in my house. And I always invited her to family events. And I always reached out to her, and also to her son, who has some issues, not addiction, but some other kinds of issues. And then, so to me, that's being there, always communicating that I loved her. And
yes.
Regardless of what she did or what she did while she was using, that was never going to change. Never, never.
Yeah. Yeah. And honestly, that is a higher level way to be approaching this. Most people have a very difficult time dropping the judgment and that surrounds this disease. So how did you I mean, did you have a path to that way of thinking about it?
Well, I think in my former life, before I was an executive coach, I was also a therapist. So I think that background really helped me to both have distance and not take whatever she did personally, or to think that that was who she was. It wasn't who she was.
Yeah.
So it was that kind of separation that I think helped me. And also, I knew her growing up. I knew what had happened to her. So I got a lot of understanding and empathy for that.
And so as a therapist, you had a window in that a lot of people don't.
I think so. Yes, I think so. A way to be non-judgmental. Even as I thought she might destroy herself, I knew that wasn't the person, and that I just had to be there while she found her way.
Right. And I mean, I've come to that place. And I do think for a lot of people, that's it. How do we love somebody deeply and almost witness their suffering? To some extent, that's kind of the questions that some people have asked me, is how, I mean, sometimes it's framed in, how do I stand by and watch this happen?
Well, that was more difficult with my daughter, but in this case, because of the natural distance, I think that helped a little bit. I just couldn't be there in some ways, but I would visit. I would do all kinds of things. I think it's so important to understand the disease.
Yes.
And what it does to people, so that you are able to see how they are not the same. And even when people do illegal things, when they're using all of those kinds of things, it's to recognize what the culprit is. And it's not their character.
Yeah. And so can you say a little bit more about your understanding of the disease, which helped you come to this understanding of how to love somebody in the midst of it?
Well, I think, first of all, that I'm very fortunate, because I have never had an inkling to use more alcohol or anything else. And I've seen people respond extremely differently to it. So I would say, first of all, it's recognizing that for whatever reason, I'll have it.
Right.
It would take some things for me to be an addict. I don't use alcohol when I'm not feeling well, all of those kinds of things. So I think it's recognizing that my chemistry is different.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing is, between my daughter and my former husband, I have been to 3 inpatients and one outpatient. So there was a lot of education. And that, to be a family member and to attend, that was extremely helpful. Because then I got a sense of the etiology, and of course, most of the people working in those programs have been through their own recovery. Right. So really getting a sense of what that was about, not from books, but from through it.
Right. And do you remember in the early stages, certainly with your former husband and your daughter, what was the learning that took place for you? Because my experience was, on the front end of this, was I had to cobble together these resources in order to understand this disease. It wasn't like readily available. And I found that frustrating, to say the least. And there were certain things that kind of fell into place the more I asked questions and the more I read and the more I talked to people. But there were pivotal things along the way that were very important for me to go, oh, okay, that's what this disease is.
Yeah. So first of all, I think Al-Anon is very helpful, but it wasn't helpful to me.
It wasn't helpful to me either.
Yeah. It's just, I wasn't there to give other people therapy about issues. And it can be extremely helpful for a lot of people. So I just want to be clear about that.
Right.
So I have a friend who, 2 friends, close friends, who worked in inpatient alcohol treatment programs in Seattle, Group Health. So they were extremely helpful. They were godparents to my daughter, and she was in Seattle. So I had really good support there and really good help.
Yeah.
And I think that was a major contributing issue.
Mhm.
I think that the other thing is, like I said, it really helped me most to hear the stories of other people, to be honest.
Mhm.
That's what helped me. And I think this notion of, oh, it's a disease that's caused by this or that, it's caused by a number of things. And to realize that there isn't one cause and there isn't one thing to blame.
Right.
There are a plethora of situations. And I really learned that with my daughter more than anything else, because she definitely had the genetics for it on her father's side of the family.
Okay.
But also there was some other things going on, which she's really described to me since then. Because she's been clean and sober for 18 years, 15 years.
Good for her. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So
there were multiple factors at play in her disease.
yes. And she had been to inpatient treatment around her father. So she probably had some understanding of it. She's a smart cookie. But I think also just seeking out support always.
Right.
Always. I mean, I would go looking for my daughter to go in the morning, and I would just call up a friend of mine, the historian, and we would head out in the car. And it was having that kind of support around me that was so, so helpful.
Right. Right. Well, I think, that community of support that has your back and is not bring the judgment to the table and is willing to walk the walk with you is mission critical to figure out a way to navigate this as sanely as possible.
Yeah, because you're so afraid of them dying.
Right.
I mean, you're afraid of people dying when they get other kinds of diseases, but this one, you just don't know, and it's not in your control.
Right.
So that's the toughest part, I think.
Yeah. And I do think it's the toughest part, is it is out of a control and the fear, almost desperation at times. So how do you handle that psychologically?
Well, I think at some point after I had, to me, it's different when it's an adult. In some ways, it's not totally different than when it's your kid. But I think that's where the inpatient treatment was so helpful. Also, the outpatient treatment that was pretty intense, is to recognize this whole notion of, it's hard, but it's this whole notion of being detached from what they're doing themselves.
Yeah.
And at the same, and doing that in a way that isn't emotional, that doesn't communicate blame, even if you're trying to control things. Why are you doing this? What are you doing? And I learned that I just need to back away from that. And really realize that they were making choices, and I needed to somehow always communicate, I love you. And there are consequences to this.
Right.
And to do that in a way that was real, but at the same time empathetic. So that to me was one of the best things I learned from treatment.
Yeah.
Family member, is to how to do that.
Right.
How to not get so emotionally invested that they were reacting to that in me.
Right. And so then how did you handle your own fear?
That's a good question. I went to therapy.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay.
I forgot that part. I'm sorry. I forgot that part. and I usually make that choice when there are things like that going on. I'm not going to do this by myself. So that was helpful. And again, being open and talking to my friends. And I just I do have a lot of friends that are psychologists and people, but they were, they were there, and I could talk to them about anything. I didn't hide it from my friends and family. I just didn't do that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
At the same time, I certainly didn't broadcast it out to the world.
Sure.
But not my friends and family.
Yeah. Well, and to some extent, extraordinarily grateful that you had friends and family that you could turn to, that you could talk this out with and feel safe and held and psychologically okay. And so, yes, therapy, fantastic, great friends to be able to talk to and have them be there when you need them the most, educating yourself on the disease and learning what really works versus what doesn't work, in terms of how you respond and be with the person who's in the midst of the disease. And so I'm also curious as to your own journey in terms of your self-care around this.
Well, at the time my daughter started getting into it, there were several things going on. I moved my parents to where I lived, and they were gone in a year.
Oh, wow.
And I was getting divorced.
Okay.
I was getting a divorce in part because of the addiction. And I was done. I was done. And there might have been some things, as I saw in my daughter, that actually clarified that with my marriage.
Mm.
There was this line, and that line was, I'm done.
Mm-hmm.
Recognizing what that line is. And I'm never done with my daughter.
Right.
Never.
Right.
That doesn't mean I would always want her in my house or, depending upon what happened, but I'm never done.
Right.
I'm never done. And that to me is a crucial difference between, I think, so come back to the question. I'm sorry.
I think one of the things that is most challenging for most people is
self-care.
Your own self-care.
Right. I think, again, having that therapy, also just taking care of myself physically, which that's sort of my thing to do that. And because I have my own business, I'm able to make choices around that. And I just sort of do that naturally. But, with my daughter, the most important thing was showing up and then maintaining those appropriate boundaries. I will say one thing about treatment. It takes a few times for most people. 2 to 3 at least.
Yeah.
People don't understand that.
The average is 7 to 8.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
And what I learned is that they're really good for detoxing.
Yeah.
But once they get the education, then it's a different journey. And then they have to start making other choices when they get out. So when people see treatment as a panacea, I would say it's not.
No.
It really isn't.
Yeah.
And, so that was one of the things. By the third time, I was like, okay, I know what this is, right?
Right. Yes.
And then she made some bad choices, and I was watching it and hearing about it, and it was distressing. It was distressing to watch. It really was.
Yeah. And so in those moments, because I think, anybody who's listening to this has been, in those distressing moments, in those moments of panic and desperation and shattered dreams. How did you navigate your way through that? Because I think people want to know is how do you do this?
Well, first of all, I know that your organization is offering resources that I probably could have used, but I didn't have them other than Al-Anon, especially where I live. There was nothing other than therapists who could help me out with that. And one of the therapists that I went to for marriage counseling, he actually had an addiction background. Then that was very helpful, very, very helpful. So going to people who actually specialize can be very, very helpful.
Yeah.
The other person just knew a lot. So I for me, that was absolutely critical. I had to have a place to go. I really had a place to go. And it got to the point where especially after my parents died, that I was really able to focus on my daughter and what she was doing. And then I gave her some choices to move from Boise away from the playground and the playmates and all those things that she got to do. And that's when she went to treatment for a third time up in Seattle. So I think just having people to talk to a lot about it, I got to tell you, to me, that was everything. And eventually I had a significant other, a new person in my life, and he was really cool about talking about it with me as well. And we would go through those phone calls at night.
Yeah.
Yeah. That she was calling me, and I was wondering if she was safe. I mean, it's a lot of issues, right?
Right. Yeah.
So I will tell you that the thing that made the difference First of all, I got her a very good therapist. Very good. I was very lucky. Very lucky. But the second thing is, it was her decision. And she tells me this to this day. There was a point where she kind of woke up and she said, okay, I'm not going to do this. And I'm going to go back to school. She called me up and I said, well, that's just great. Now you'll go to the community college. And she did. She did very well. And she got a scholarship to the UW. Then she went to a very good law school. And she just realized, I don't want to live this life. This is not okay. I really want to move on. And she tells me all the time, Mom, it's nothing about you or your parenting.
Right.
I had to make a decision at some point. It wasn't my decision.
Right.
That's something I really noticed in the two people that actually stuck with recovery, is them owning that decision.
Right. Yes. I that's been my experience. That is absolutely true. And kind of the counter to that as a parent, I think somewhere along the way, we got the message that we're supposed to keep our kids from suffering, and we're supposed to fix it for them. And actually challenging those two beliefs and shifting them, I think for a lot of parents is a big lift.
It is. Well, I would have done anything. I thought, in my mind, there was a part of me that says, I would do anything to keep her from going through this. And there was another part of me that says, yeah, but you can't do that. You can't do that. It is her decision.
Right.
All I can do is be there for her as she makes these decisions. And there were some tough times. I will tell you something, though. We are extraordinarily close. And I think going through all that made a difference.
I have no doubt. Yeah, because I do think that the bedrock of really powerful relationships is unconditional love.
Yeah.
And I know in my own journey with this, I have kind of wrestled with that notion of how do I continue to love him deeply and be a witness to and a participant in his suffering until he's ready to make a decision about his own life.
Yeah. No, it's true. And again, being a parent is in fact very, very, very different from that. You know, the other thing is my daughter had very supportive grandparents. And they didn't judge. They showed up for her in different ways and they never judged. And I think it also made a difference. Even though they weren't living where we were living, she was close to them. And that was huge. So expanding family to include others who can step into that space.
Right.
Now, they may not have understood all the things about addiction, but they understood she as a person is different than her addiction.
Right. Yeah. Wow, that's extraordinary. Number one, that for that generation. And at the same time, for her to have that kind of love and support in the midst of all of this. Yeah, very, very cool.
On the other thing I just want to share, my daughter was incredible at tidying stuff.
Oh, they are masters.
Oh my God. I mean, here, I'll tell you about something I discovered recently.
Okay.
I remember seeing money going out of my bank account. Right.
No. Okay.
It wasn't a lot, but it was money.
Yeah.
It turned out, and I did not know this, my daughter almost has a photographic memory for numbers. And to this day, she can look at my damn credit card and tell me what the numbers are. Right. So we kind of laugh about that. I'm like, oh my God, you're able to do that. And she says, yeah, I can keep track of all the court cases. And I said, oh my God, I didn't know that. And she kind of smiled. And yeah, those kinds of things. And then a spouse really hid stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, it was, and of course, after a while, you hide yourself is what happens.
Yes.
It isn't just the addiction. You're hiding you're hiding your pain, all of those kinds of things. Right. And that's really what ended the marriage. I mean, yeah. You know, I tried to be supportive and empathetic and things like that. And he never, the treatment never really took.
Right.
She also saw that.
Yes, I'm sure. Yeah. And I mean, obviously she sounds ridiculously smart, which a lot of them are. I know my son is. And so the manipulation, is part of the disease, the hiding. I mean, I know from him that there are so many stories that I will never know, and I don't care to know, that he has lived through. And I was talking to, exactly, and I don't need to know. I know enough to know how traumatized he's been by his own disease. And now part of his work is to heal from the trauma of the disease.
No, I think that's true. And I think people forget that because there's so much focus on, oh, this is about your disease, as opposed to realizing that the disease, in a very real way, victimizes them as well.
Yes.
And I don't think we actually talk about that much.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you brought that up.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's just this loop of shame for the person who has the disease that is, in some respects, crippling.
Oh, for sure. I think, frankly, AA was probably the best way for her to come to grips with that.
Mm-hmm.
And when she was in Seattle, I asked her why she didn't go to the AA meetings at the university, and she said because they're not real.
Mm-hmm.
So she do you know anything about Seattle? So she would go.
Oh yeah,
on Aurora, because those folks had the real consequences, and she wanted to remind herself of what that was.
Right. Wow, that's really smart on her part.
Yeah, but I think that part of AA was incredibly helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And the experience I had with my spouse is that he would go to the meetings and think he was special and different.
Yeah, and that was the disease.
True story.
Yeah. And it definitely is a different navigation to do it with a spouse versus doing it with a child.
Yeah, there's really no question about that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the really hard part about the disease is how quickly it takes hold.
Mm-hmm.
That's the other part.
Mm-hmm.
Not always. I mean, maybe alcohol is different, but how quickly it takes hold.
Mm-hmm.
And that's tough, is that trajectory is so quick that it barely gives you time to catch your breath, because all of a sudden it's there.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, a lot of people that I've interviewed that have, are in recovery at this point talk about like their first drink, and that was the first time where they felt actually like themselves. And in that moment, everything changed. And so then, just like you're talking about, is all of a sudden this takes place. They're on a trajectory that isn't in the open. And then we find out when things start to fall apart.
That's correct.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And by then, they've already been engaged in it. I think the other thing is making excuses for them.
Yes.
I was really guilty of that in the beginning.
Yeah.
Well, it's this or that or whatever.
Right.
Yeah. And that's part of the disease effect on me, which is I don't want to see it. I don't really want to acknowledge it. So I'm going to make up this stuff so that I don't have to.
Mm-hmm. And did you find yourself doing that more with your former husband than your daughter?
And I think there was more shame there.
Mm-hmm.
Much more. Yeah. I don't think I felt that toward my daughter or my niece.
Mm-hmm.
Very much at all. But boy, yeah, I did.
Mm-hmm.
Because, and it's so interesting how many people in our lives also didn't see it.
Right.
And we're sort of shocked. And it was there.
Mm-hmm.
Smart people.
Right.
Go for a therapist, they didn't see it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I just interviewed a woman who wrote a book and was married to a functioning alcoholic who was extraordinarily successful. And that is the hole she fell in, was loyalty to her husband, and nobody in the outside saw it. So she was alone in it. And the the cone of silence that she felt she had to hold on to just about killed her.
Yeah, that would be really tough. I couldn't do that.
Right. Me either.
It would just eat me up inside.
Mm-hmm.
So that sounds extraordinarily hard.
Yeah, I can't imagine. I mean, I was married a long time ago to Sam's dad, who was a Vietnam vet and alcoholic. And the first post-traumatic stress episode, I found out who the specialist was in our community, counseling-wise. And I was on it. There was no way I could have survived it if I hadn't had that kind of support. So professional help, as long as they're really good,
yeah,
mission critical. But you do really need to look for people who are really good at what they do in that arena. And then if you do have friends or family that can hold the space for you, and support you and listen to you and be present, fantastic. And then I remember I interviewed a gentleman not too long ago, and he asked his son, what can I do to support you? And his son said, do your work, Dad, and so that's the other piece of this. And you did your work. So I want to remind those who are listening is we have a role in this too. Not in terms of blame or things we did or anything along those lines, but there's a deeper level of work for us to do in the midst of loving somebody who is either in the throes of addiction and even on the side of recovery too.
I think that's true, KL. And I know this sounds odd, but it's like everything in life. It's an opportunity to learn a lot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And there were times when I said, I really don't want to learn this, frankly.
Yeah.
But, it wasn't on my radar.
Right.
But at the same time, as I look back at this point, I'm like, wow, I learned a lot. And it helps me to see the world differently. It helps me to help people that are leaders that are going through some of this.
Yes.
Because I can see it sometimes.
Right.
And I'm able to, even though I'm not a therapist, but I'm able to at least see some things and also help them address it if they bring it up,
right,
about where they can go. So, in the end, it helped to make me the person that I am. Doesn't matter that I didn't want it. Nobody wants this. Nobody wants this in their life. And
no.
I look around and I ask people, there are very few people that don't have this in their families.
Absolutely. I mean, we are definitely at pandemic, epidemic, whatever you want to call it, levels at this point. It's like 1 in 3 families. And so that's why, for me, this notion of staying silent or being steeped in shame and judgment is almost unconscionable from a human perspective, because so many of us are in the throes of loving somebody who is dealing with this disease.
Yeah. And how many people are high functioning? They're in workplaces, they're in leadership positions, and people see it and they don't confront it. It's tough.
Mm-hmm.
It's really tough.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like I said, I'm glad that this helped me to be the person that I am.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree with you. You're farther along in the years of recovery than I am at this point, and I would still say I wouldn't change anything. Because for me personally, I think this whole notion of our kids are different for us is that cracked me wide open in a way that nothing else could have, and I needed the cracking in order to access these parts of myself that had yet to be expressed or given life or, whatever. And because we're in the times that we're in and the work that we both do, I do think that it's been in preparation for this time.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think we also all have to make ourselves available to others.
Yes.
So that they can get the support that they need to get through this.
Mm-hmm.
There's one other thing that I think is affected, and that is that there's a part of me that knows that it may happen again.
Right.
And I just have to accept that.
Mm-hmm.
It probably won't, and it may.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the serenity prayer is not just for people who are addicts, but for the rest of us.
Right. Yeah, I think the serenity prayer is for life.
Yeah. So very much so.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just grateful that right now, the two people that I am close to and love are in really good places.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very grateful for that.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'm grateful that you are less tired and more rejuvenated, and are starting to get your spark back.
Like I said, there are just things outside of our control.
Yes, there are.
There are.
Yeah.
You don't want to push the river because the river is going to win. So how do you flow?
Right.
But how do you navigate it, right? That's the great metaphor, especially if you live in Idaho, but Oregon as well.
Yeah, you froze, Jan. So could you say that last part again?
Yeah. Basically, I said I've learned not to push the river.
Mm-hmm.
But to say to myself, I'm on this river and my job is to navigate it. And I'm a big river person, so that metaphor works for me.
Yeah.
The rapids change. They're not always the same, depending upon the flow. So you've got to really read them, and you've got to use your knowledge to navigate through them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not always easy, but I think that's what life is, frankly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I think as long as we're engaged with living our lives, there's always going to be something that shows up that's going to be new and stretches our edges and causes, the opportunity for us to rise to another version of ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's true. I tend to think, oh, I think I'm done, and then I'm not. I'm done. I'm done growing this much. Can we just stop for a moment? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I tend to think that when I am done, I'll be dead.
Well, that's true because I don't think I want to just be hanging out without learning. So that's true. But these emotional pieces are, it does take it out of you, and you gotta find ways to replenish. And I would say this: if people were judgmental about these people in my lives, they probably didn't last as my friend.
Right.
You have a choice of who's around you and who isn't.
Yes. And
either they're going to be all in or they're not. So there are some relatives, not too many, but that were just kind of like, well, I don't really need to be spending time with you. I don't need to talk to you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's not going to work for me. So that's the other choice.
Well, and
who do you want around you?
Yeah. And I mean, yes, exactly. Right. And being choiceful about who they are and knowing what serves you and what doesn't serve you.
Exactly.
And being willing to take a stand in terms of, if that doesn't serve me, I'm going to distance myself to protect my own energy, but also to help me move with this in the direction that I choose to move in the direction of my own intentionality around this. Yeah.
And it's okay to make those choices. It's really okay. And I think sometimes that's hard for people. And sometimes I have to kind of go, oh, well, that's not working out. I really don't need that in my life.
Right. Yeah.
I tend to I tend to love people and love relationships, but these days, if they're not working, I'm done. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I tend to think that kind of potentially comes with age. That we get to this point, at least I have gotten to this point where, I'm in the last third. And so I have less patience for playing with people that are kind of, steeped in negativity or victimhood or judgment and shame and all of the things. I don't have the energy for it anymore.
I have a little story that I want to end with.
Okay, great.
The outpatient program my daughter came to was pretty hardcore. The guy who ran it, he was kind of like a sergeant in the military. But
okay.
Seriously. And it was 4 nights a week. And one night the parents came because he wanted the parents to get a sense of how to really parent their children in a way that didn't let them skate on stuff. And
Yeah.
my daughter to this day does not like this person, but that's okay. So, but what's interesting is that there was a guy in there who had a daughter, and we would see each other over the years, and he ended up in my trusted advisor group.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Because after a while, we didn't really talk about it. We just talked about whatever. He was a financial person. And it's so interesting how every once in a while, we'll just bring that up in the group. Our relationship and what we learned, if it's relevant. And one of the things I want to say to parents is also find parents who are going through this like you.
Yes.
Because there's a very special understanding there. And I'm just grateful that, and his daughter is fine. But I'm just grateful that we still have this contact. That's pretty amazing. And that was, oh my gosh, that was 22 years ago.
Right. Yeah, that's pretty extraordinary.
Yes,
and I mean, you're both so blessed that you have good stories, on the other end of this, so if you can find those parents that kind of see this journey similarly to you, that is a bond that I think is one of those unbreakable bonds, because there's a knowing about this that our other parents don't have.
Right. No, it's true. And I think it does lessen the shame, because you're looking around the room at all these parents and we're all going through the same thing. It didn't matter what we did for a living. None of that mattered.
Right.
And I think that was really special. And because we had the same challenges and we didn't feel so alone. We had people that were doing this like us, who talked to each other. And it also helped with the shame.
Yeah.
So there might have been some things that weren't perfect about that, but I really think it helped. It certainly helped me.
I mean, I think the ability to share amongst people who understand is super powerful.
Yes. Yeah, we know that too from other online kinds of groups and places where, with certain medical conditions or other things, it's, if you look at, I'm just going to speak as a professional at this point, if you look at the psychological research, it's social support.
Right.
What we're talking about is what kind do you need?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yep. And it just, pokes at and hopefully shatters this whole notion of silence, doing this alone, steeping yourself in the shame of it too, it has to stop in order for us to be able to be healthy and whole.
And I think that's what your work is all about. So thank you again.
Yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't be doing it if it wasn't for Sam. So I want to say thank you. You have a much richer experience that I know about now than I knew previously. And I appreciate you sharing that and the wisdom of all the things that contributed to your being able to find your way in a healthy way and then be the person that you are in your work today, which we so need.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Kale. If there's anything I can do to support your work, please let me know.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Jan.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us in this episode. We hope this discussion gives you the empowerment you need during these challenging times. Remember, there is always light after darkness. For more inspiring conversations like this one, subscribe to the show at voicesencouraged.com/podcast. We encourage you to share with your friends and family going through similar situations so we can continue to build a strong community of hope and possibility. Start your life-changing journey today. Join our community at voicesencouraged.com.